All right, 7:30, let's get started. I will start just with a couple of announcements this morning before introducing our speaker. I'm also part of the Grand Rounds Committee with Josh and Hillary, so hopefully I'll be up here introducing a couple more speakers over the course of this year. Announcements, after we hear from Dr. Manchaiah this morning, our next Grand Rounds is October 2nd, 2025, and we're piloting a new format. We talked a lot about our division's strategic plan and how we would really benefit from hearing a lot more about regular updates of small things that people in our group are doing in terms of research. So we're going to pilot a lightning rounds where we have a brief talk from Josh, Zach, as well as Sarah, just to get a quick update on what's going on. Not a full formal talk. Hopefully it's lower key, and we'll see how that works. I think in the future, we'll try to see whether or not we can have joint presentations, including people from doing health services research as well. But we'll look forward to that on October 2nd. Then next Journal Club will be November 13th, where Gretchen and Kate will be presenting, and some other announcements. We have a division meeting after today's presentation. After today's Grand Rounds, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording and a copy of the PowerPoint. A reminder to please fill out your evaluations, and an online link to the evaluation is in that email as well. And please submit questions in the chat or in the QA boxes at any time during this presentation. So without further ado, I'm introducing Dr. Manchaiah. He's an audiologist with an MBA and a PhD. I did some reading about him. He is very well traveled and has collaborated extensively around the world, including with relationships with South Africa as well as in Sweden. He's a professor in the ENT department at the University of Colorado, and he's the director of audiology here at the University of Colorado Hospital. He's the principal investigator at the Virtual Hearing Lab. I think we'll hear a little bit about some of that work this morning. And he has a position as an extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and an adjunct professorship at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education in India. He's had various clinical, research, teaching, and administrative roles, and his current academic appointment centers predominantly on research and clinical leadership. His research mainly focuses on improving accessibility, affordability, and the outcomes of hearing and balance disorders by promoting self-management and the use of digital technologies. He's participated in several research roadshows, and as Jody has mentioned, the line is usually out the door where people want to come and see his work. He's authored over 265 peer-reviewed manuscripts and 6 textbooks, and he's going to talk to us about emerging technologies for mild and moderate hearing loss.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for so much for being here, and I'm grateful for this time. I'm hoping to spend about 40 minutes talking, and then we should have time for questions. Fortunately, I don't have any meetings after this, so I'm happy to hang on if there are any questions or discussions, that comes later. So in this talk, I am thinking, or I'm hoping to cover what's happening in the hearing space in terms of technology, as well as how the technology reaches people, in terms of service delivery models. So I have not been to these grand rounds. I've done some for internal medicine and other folks, but I don't know what the format is. So I was hoping that we will have a mixture of clinicians and researchers, and I thought I'll keep this fairly introductory. At the end of this, I'm hoping that you could have a conversation to somebody about what types of devices available and things like that. And if any of this is interesting, we could definitely talk in depth. I can talk more. So here's what I'm thinking. I'll start with a very quick background information on what happens if you don't treat somebody with a pre-existing hearing loss, and then transition into introducing about different types of hearing devices. And then most of my talk will focus on point 3 and 4, which is who may be likely to succeed from these devices if they're not supported through professional services. I'm also going to do a lot of research update on direct-to-consumer devices and service delivery models. But I have to stress the point that this is going to be a highly condensed version, in the interest of time. So I'll basically give like a high-level summary there. But again, that is an area that may be of interest to you if you're thinking about how to change some of the service delivery model in where you work, or if you're interested in health service research topics. And then again, I am hoping that we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So this may not be new information for you, that there are a lot of people with hearing loss in the country. So depending on where you read, there are usually 1 in 5 or 1 in 7 people with hearing loss. And this is also not a new information that hearing losses increases by function of age. That means, generally, as we get older, there is higher chances that somebody will have hearing loss. And this graph also shows different degrees of hearing loss. So here, the lighter the shade, meaning milder degree, the darker the shade, meaning more severe degrees. So basically showing that irrespective of which age category, we could have people having different degree or severity of hearing loss. So, another really quick information is that hearing loss has many risk factors and comorbidities. So age is one of the biggest risk factors for developing hearing loss, followed by noise and many other things. But we also know that there are things like diabetes and hypertension and other things could have some influence on hearing. Even if it does not cause a measurable hearing loss, it could actually cause changes in the inner ear. That could have consequences for our speech and noise understanding. One of the reasons hearing loss has got a lot of attention in the last decade or so is because of potential connection between hearing loss and dementia. So this is something that I get asked all the time on, how big is the connection? Is there a strong and whatever? So what we know is that there is actually compelling evidence that hearing loss and dementia are connected. I think mechanistically, we are still not clear how this relationship exists. So is hearing loss caused by dementia? I think that part is not clear. I think there is more and more evidence to show that it could be, and there are 3 different mechanisms, that could cause. But anyway, I think 2 really important things to think about here is one. So the Lancet Commission for Dementia basically kind of identified hearing loss as one of the leading modifiable risk factors for hearing loss, so accounting for up to 8%. And again, this at a population level, not at an individual level. That is one thing to keep in mind. And also some really nice work at Johns Hopkins has basically demonstrated that degree of hearing loss can have influence on this connection. For instance, even people who have a mild degree of hearing loss could have, risk of dementia increased. So this is really important because a lot of people with mild or a moderate degree of hearing loss, they may not be aware that they have some degree of disability. And then another question that gets asked all the time is, can this be reversed? Can dementia be reversed by using hearing devices? That part, I think, is still, out in the door and not very clear answers. I think there are a couple of insights. There was a systematic review published in JAMA Neurology a couple of years ago, basically showing that use of hearing aids and interventions such as cochlear implants could actually reduce the risk of dementia. There was a very popular study from Johns Hopkins, Achieve trial, that got a lot of media attention. Basically, failed to show that hearing dementia the risk of dementia can be reduced with hearing intervention in a general group, whereas it did show that in a high-risk dementia population, use of hearing intervention could reduce the risk by half. And there's also, I think, a more recent observational study showing that that association could be true. But again, I think the message I'm trying to get across here is that I think we know that hearing loss and dementia are somewhat connected. We don't know how exactly very well. The reverse part is not very clear, although you see all the time marketing claims saying that, oh, if you use devices, it can be reversed. I think that part is not clear at all. I think there are a few indications that it could be, but we don't know much. But even if you keep this part aside, I think there are some good reasons why we should think about hearing loss. One, we know that use of interventions, any interventions, hearing devices, communication strategies, or anything that we can think of, helps in reduced hearing disability, improved communication, increased confidence that translates into getting a job or having a higher salary, things like that, improved social interactions, mental health, and at the end of the day, improved general health-related quality of life. And on the last point, usually when we think about general health-related quality of life, when we look at hearing aids, usually the effect sizes tend to be smaller. When we look at interventions such as cochlear implants, the effect sizes tend to be larger. That is mainly because of thinking about whether they have a small problem or a big problem in their life and how much difference that it makes in their general life. Um, uh, Despite I think a reasonably good evidence that hearing interventions could work, I think hearing loss is still considered as a hidden disability. And on average, people take about 7 to 10 years before, by the time they realize, before they see somebody, before they make an act. But some recent industry data actually provides some new insights to this, basically showing that these are average figures. But when we look at this data very closely, there seems to be a bimodal distribution. That means some people tend to act fairly quickly, within realizing that they have some hearing problem. They try to do something very quickly within the first year or two. Others may take 15, 20 years. And if you average that, that basically gives 7 to 10 years. So what I'm trying to stress here is that I think there are a lot of people who are interested in knowing what options are available and maybe taking an action. But there is also some evidence to suggest that those actions are all, the first step may be, depending on what they do, they can go further or they can be stopped. So let's say they go and have a conversation with the primary care, and then the primary care physician may say, well, you have, but I'm talking to you fine, and I don't really see anything, and then they may basically stop their journey there. So I think this part is really important to think about, that I think there are ways to facilitate the journey of hearing intervention sooner, and people don't have to wait that long. And there are some even good reason now to do that than 10 years ago, and I'll come to that in a little bit. And here is a graph that shows hearing aid uptake. So this is not the data that shows how much people are using hearing aids, how they're benefiting, things like that. This is basically how many people with hearing loss of different degree purchase hearing aids. Okay, so you see that on the top of the figure we have profound hearing loss, followed by moderate to severe, followed by mild to moderate. So generally, people with a higher degree or severity tend to purchase devices. That is obvious, because if you have the higher degree of hearing loss, that is, you'll probably face more problems in real life, and then people will complain, and then you'll probably end up purchasing a device. But what we know is the degree of hearing loss is not necessarily a good indicator of success. So when I say success, so purchasing the devices maybe is one step, and then using them, and then getting benefit and satisfaction through that. And what we know from a large body of evidence is that self-reported disability. So if somebody feels that they have a problem and they're noticing disability in their real life, that is a biggest predictor of success. That means that factor can predict who will purchase, who will use, and who will get benefit and satisfaction through these devices. In addition to that, you see the last, the bottom of this image, you'll see even people who have normal hearing. We know now that anywhere between 12 to 15% of people who have normal hearing could have speech and noise difficulties. So cocktail party effect, that basically means when they go get tested in audiology, they get told that they have normal hearing, they don't need to do anything, but they have a lot of problems, in real life. So for some of those, we have terminologies that we can assign, subclinical hearing loss, central artery processing disorders and things like that. But for many people, there are no clinical definitions that we could, assign. Essentially, these are the people who also don't get any help because they don't have a diagnosis. And if they don't have a diagnosis, even if their insurance covers anything, they're usually not given any kind of intervention. So for the remaining of my talk, I'm actually going to focus on this bulk of the population, basically people who have mild to moderate hearing loss, and also maybe who have clinically normal hearing when we do audiometric testing, but maybe have speech and noise difficulties and things like that. I thought that could be of interest to you, mainly because you may come across those population much more frequently than people with severe to profound hearing loss. So now I want to start introducing you to what kinds of device categories are available currently. And so in the last 10 years, there has been a merger of medical devices and consumer audio devices, creating a whole series of hybrid devices. So currently, the hearing aids doesn't need to look anything like the ones you may have seen, in the advertisements or things like that. So it could look like one of the wearable device, or it could be just a smartphone application. So here is an image of current devices in the US market. So to the one end, the blue, you see prescription hearing aids. I think most of you may be familiar with that. And then to the other end, you have consumer audio. Again, anything that we use on a daily basis. I think these two categories are fairly clear. And then you see in between, we have many different categories of devices. So we have three different types of over-the-counter hearing aids. So these are devices that are registered or regulated by FDA. So you see self-fitting OTC hearing aids, preset OTC hearing aids, and then Apple AirPod Pro 2 and 3 now are, they have an FDA clearance as an OTC hearing aid called as a hearing aid feature. These three categories of devices are meant to be for people with perceived mild to moderate hearing loss. So, whoever has this perceived mild to moderate hearing loss, they could pursue these devices through any number of channels. We do have other categories, for instance, personal sound amplification system and hearables. And many of these have features and functionalities that may be applicable for people with hearing loss. But the important thing is that they're not supposed to be marketed for people with hearing loss. Instead, they're supposed to be for anybody be seen as more of a hearing enhancement devices. Okay, but the point is, a really good quality PSAP can be helpful for many people with mild to moderate hearing loss. Okay, so while there are differences in how they should be marketed and where you can buy them, things like that, I think there are a range of devices that are in the market that could be of help. And again, just to recap, we have three different types of OTC devices. I'm going to skip the PSAP part and focus on these three devices. So the preset OTC basically means these devices come with a preset programs. Okay, so it could have 2 programs or 4 programs, and people don't have to have a high level of technology, competency. They could buy these devices, put it on, and then there you go. They could just choose one of the programs, and then that is it. The self-fitting devices are a little bit more advanced. So those usually come with an accompanying smartphone app. That means you put the device on, you connect it to a smartphone, and you kind of do in situ hearing test. So they could do their own hearing test and use that hearing test to adjust, the profile of hearing gains that they need. And then we also have hearing aid feature, which basically works somewhat like self-fitting hearing aids, but it is costed around a preset, devices. For instance, when you look at devices now, they could look anything like that. But the most important part is here. For instance, when you look at preset OTC devices, they start at about $100 and they go all the way to $400-500. And then the hearing aid features, so $250, but in sale, people could buy for like $180 or something like that, like AirPod Pro 2s. And then OTC self-fitting hearing aids. These are high-end hearing aids. Again, they start around $600, but average price is around $800 to $1,000. There are really high-end self-fitting OTCs that also cost like $2,400. And then you have prescription hearing aids. Okay, so now you may ask me a question: what is the difference? Why is there such a big difference in cost? So one way to think about this is that they're all there could be quite a difference in technology. For instance, some of these devices could have very basic noise reduction algorithms. Others could have very advanced noise reduction algorithms, things like that. The second biggest reason is basically how they're retailed. All of the over-the-counter devices are supposed to be retailed direct to consumer, whereas prescription hearing aids tend to come, retailed to audiology or hearing aid dispensers, and who generally have a bundled services. That means they usually don't charge for testing, supports, whatever. They tend to put all that together as a device, sees. And another way to think about for me is many of these OTC devices are basically, if I go back several generations, like if I go back 5, 6, 10 years ago, what used to be prescription hearing aids now in somewhat like OTC hearing aids, just because we have moved on in technology and the earlier technology is being kind of packaged as OTC devices. So that is one way to think about. And there is a huge variability in the features, functionality, and how good these are. And I'll come to that in a little bit. But just to give you a sense that I think in terms of affordability, now we have a whole range of devices in the market that could be of help. There is not a whole lot of knowledge on what makes somebody more successful or less successful in terms of using these devices, using OTC devices. But we do have this knowledge from studying prescription hearing aids. So looking at the journey of hearing aid users. So for somebody who want to pursue this journey, first they have to identify that they have a problem, and usually they have to identify it pretty accurately. For instance, if somebody has a severe hearing loss and they're thinking that they have a mild problem and end up purchasing these devices may not have adequate gain, adequate amplification to meet their needs. So they have to first identify that they have a problem, and that is of a mild or moderate degree. The second is even more difficult step: choose and purchase an appropriate device. So at one time, like 3, 4, 5 years ago, we had very few devices that are accessible direct to consumer. Now, if you go online, you'll see like 100 plus devices, 50 plus companies marketing these devices. So very confusing, not just for a consumer audiologist. And I actually work on this space. Even for me, it is highly confusing which device is good. I kind of test them on these devices on a monthly basis. We purchase new devices. So this, I think, is probably the most confusing part. So people could end up with a reasonably good device, or they could end up with a really bad device that doesn't have any benefit at all. And then after they purchase a reasonably good device, they have to, depending on what it is, they have to either select. If it is a preset, they have to select a right program. Or if it is a self-fitting, they have to kind of do all the steps and then adjust their amplification. And then once they do that, they have to learn how to handle this, how to charge this, how to clean this, things like that. And then again, do all the ongoing troubleshooting, things like that. I think many people in the general population are very capable of doing all these steps. And as all of you know, working with older adults, you'll also see that maybe there are even more, even larger population that probably won't navigate through all of these steps. Maybe they'll navigate through some, but maybe doesn't navigate through all the steps. So the question is, how can we support these people? And again, I'll come to that in a little bit later today. Another thing that has been talked about is, if we open this up a lot, we could actually miss some really serious, medical issues. We have to screen for red flags, things like if they have asymmetrical hearing loss, or if they have, ear disorders, or pulsatile tinnitus, things like that. There has been some really good work done at Northwestern demonstrating that we could actually implement a fairly simple screening methods, self-reported screening methods, which could actually screen for these ear disorders. That means we could implement something like consumer ear disease risk assessment, where they basically answer a series of questions. And depending on what the score is, we could basically tell whether or not somebody need to see any ENT or an audiologist before they pursue their hearing device journey. And again, going back to the earlier part, if I'm thinking about how can we facilitate, there are different ways of facilitating. And I think for you, in the front end of healthcare service delivery model, and I think this is where probably the biggest impact, I think right now. 2 to 3 years ago, when these devices are being conceptualized, they were not in the market yet. I was thinking we shouldn't really recommend people what devices they should buy because maybe we'll have some kind of competing interest, things like that. Now, 2 to 3 years after, because of so much confusion in the market, I think that it's easier if people just if we know what devices work and don't work, and maybe make a few recommendations. And well, if you're going on the market, maybe we should start looking at these 3 or 4 devices first. And that should have maybe different appealing factors. For instance, some could be behind the ear, some could be in the ear, things like that. Whereas at least that information can lead to people making the right device choice. And there are many other things people should also know while they purchase these devices. For instance, they should kind of know brand, warranty, return period. They should understand a little bit about features and functionalities, what kinds of customer support that can be provided from these different companies, things like that. But the nice thing is all of this can be put into a fairly simple patient education material on how to navigate. And in fact, we have developed many of those for our UC health clinics, mainly for audiology clinic, but they can be adapted for your own needs, as you wish. So with that background, let me move on to providing a really high-level update on what research evidence is available to support the use, feasibility, efficacy, and effectiveness of direct-to-consumer devices, particularly over-the-counter hearing aids. So I'll start with self-fitting devices. So these are high-end devices that cost $600 to $1,000. These generally have an app. That means people have to do a self-testing, and then they have to adjust their devices, things like that. So the original study for this came from Bose. Bose developed a hearing aid called Ear Machine, and they basically did a study. And when they did the original study, what they did was they were basically showing that self-fitting is as good as professionally fit device. For instance, they took the same device. In a randomized study, one group self-fitted the device using the algorithms that they had. And the other group, they basically use the same device, but fitted to audiology best practice. So in audiology, what we do is when we fit devices, we take hearing loss into consideration, and we have some prescription targets. So we have some formulas that can predict, here is the gain somebody may need based on the degree of hearing loss, and fit to that target. So that is still a best practice, according to what we do. So what I'm trying to say here is that they did not compare their over-the-counter device with an existing prescription device. Instead, they basically compared their own device to their own device with a different fitting method. Okay, and because of that first study, that has become like a benchmark for FDA approval. So since then, we just finished a systematic review and meta-analysis. There have been 24 studies. That means these are the studies that data was used for 510(k) approval. That means if these devices go to FDA approval, they basically look for some clinical efficacy effectiveness data. And what all the other companies have done basically is replicate this same design. Okay, so that means what we know from a large body of research is that self-fitting can be as good as audiologist fit device. There is actually no study comparing this lower technology device directly with a higher technology device. So that is really important to think about, because the question on what is the minimum technology required to produce reasonable benefit is still not answered. So when I think about this spectrum of devices, should somebody spend $100? Should I spend $6,000? Should I be in the middle and maybe spend $3,000? That is still not answered, because we have not done very good studies, looking into that. Another thing that we know, we have done a series of studies in this, is that we did a study where we basically took 6 of the self-fitting over-the-counter hearing aids. We looked at their usability, how long it takes, how easy it is for somebody to do, and then also a laboratory performance. If they put them on, or if they don't have them on, do they see a benefit in speech and noise performance in the laboratory? What we found was these devices are fairly similar in terms of their technology levels. So that means if somebody is spending $800, there is usually not a whole lot of difference you see between devices. Okay, so I think the question there is, does somebody like the devices that goes in the ear or behind the ear? What kinds of features they have? Somebody may like a Bluetooth connectivity, phone streaming, music streaming, things like that. I think when somebody is spending about $800, the question is about what type of look and feel and what kinds of features they're looking. So generally, these technologies tends to be fairly stable between devices. On the other hand, over-the-counter preset devices, these are low-cost devices. Very few studies have been done on this. In fact, I could only find 2 or 3 peer-reviewed studies. And there has been a lot published, but most of those studies published, were simulating the preset devices, not actually using the preset devices in the market. Another thing to keep in mind is the World Health Organization recommends preset devices as a device of choice for low and middle income settings. So because people may not have smartphone, and the cost of this is much lower, things like that. So we did a recent study, observational study in South Africa, where we basically provided these preset devices through community health workers. And people were pretty happy with these preset devices, and the outcomes were somewhat reasonable, for these devices. And these devices costed around $100. We're now doing an RCT, so that will basically will tell how good the outcomes are compared to self-fitting and prescription hearing aid, things like that. And then another observational study published from Northwestern fairly recently basically showed that these preset devices did not have any measurable benefit to people in terms of improving their communication. So the point I'm trying to make is that in the market, when we look, it seems like preset devices are being sold in large volumes because of the cost, but we know nothing about these devices at all. So it seems like this is open. And then there is a lot of movement from Apple in creating hearing healthcare technologies. And as you know, they had some accessibility features for several years now. But a couple of years ago, they basically, a year ago, they basically released, Apple AirPod Pro that went through FDA approval, and that became a self-fitting over-the-counter hearing aid. This is a new category because this comes under software as a medical device, so that hearing aid basically works through softwares, and then is under this category. There are a couple of studies from South Korea that were done pre-OTC. That means before Apple actually went through the FDA approval, they had some accessibility features that were fairly similar to what we have currently. And that basically showed that this could be a really good, this feature could be a really good assistive technology. And since Apple has released, I think the only study comes from our lab. In fact, I didn't have the bandwidth here, so I have to kind of program the devices and ship some of the devices to my other lab in South Africa and have to get some very quick data. And what we know from that is the hearing test feature is very accurate. So, if somebody would put their AirPods on and do the hearing test, that gives very close results to what we get in sound booth. Again, of course, we only get air conduction. We don't get bone conduction. That means we cannot tell what type of hearing loss they have, whether they have conductive or sensorineural, things like that. But in terms of the accuracy of the air conduction thresholds, very, very good. So, and reliability is also very high, and it also takes much less time. People can complete that in like 5-6 minutes on an average, compared to 15, 20, 30 minutes appointment that they need. Whereas in terms of the hearing aid feature, we felt that the usability is pretty good, but within the laboratory, we did not see a huge change in speech and noise performance. Another limitation of hearing aid feature with Apple, there are two limitations. One of that they have already overcome. The Apple AirPod Pro 2, the battery life used to be 3 to 4 hours, but if they use the hearing aid feature, it used to be 2.5 hours. Now the Apple AirPod 3, they're claiming that it has 10-hour battery life. That means people could actually use that all day long if they need. Another limitation is that the devices that sit in the ear, because of the occlusion effect, people don't usually like to wear them all day long. So that's one of the reasons why the behind the ear with receiver in the canal has become very popular, because after a couple of days or weeks, people don't even feel that they're wearing them. Whereas if you're putting your AirPod Pro, usually after 1-2 hours, you want to take them out. So it may be more situational use than use all day long. But the good news is it seems that the hearing test feature is very good. We are still waiting for some independent verification, but I think it's a reasonably good option for a starters. So if somebody doesn't have anything and they want to just try out, I think this is a very, very good option. So a few minutes in terms of, putting that up and summarizing what we have in the market. So there is a recent initiative by a company called Hear Advisor, where they basically created a consumer-centric metric. Like, if you go to purchase automobile or something like that, there are actually metrics that consumers can use. You don't need to be a specialist to kind of purchase a reasonably good quality. So what this project did was basically did a very detailed laboratory testing and synthesized that laboratory testing into a single number called as a sound score. So that goes from 0 to 5. Higher score basically meaning a better audio performance. Okay, so they had tested about 70 devices of different device categories, and I helped analyze this data. And what we found was prescription hearing aids tend to have a higher sound quality as expected, and very little difference between devices. That means it doesn't matter which brand, which device, you tend to have a pretty reasonable quality. And then the self-fitting hearing aids are also fairly similar. I think they're very close average values to prescription hearing aid, but there is some variability. But what you want to focus here is basically over-the-counter preset devices and PSAPs. That means the sound score is lower, and there is also very high variability in the sound score. That basically means, we could have some devices that are of reasonable quality, but there are a lot of devices that are also of very poor acoustic performance. And again, this is fundamental because if you don't have a reasonable acoustic performance, we don't expect that they will have a reasonable benefit in terms of improved communication and things like that. We also did this as a function of cost, to look at does the sound score increase if you pay more money? And as you see here, there is a nonlinear function. Until about $1,000, the sound score is kind of gradually increasing, and after that, it kind of saturates. That means, if somebody is spending $1,000 versus $6,000, they may not get a huge benefit in terms of audio performance. Whereas if somebody is willing to spend $200, but if they're willing to go a little bit up, I think they can definitely increase their performance. And again, these are very early data, not based on real life effectiveness, but only based on laboratory testing of these devices, which kind of gives some indication that although we have these new category, I think affordable devices at a very, very low cost is still limited. And again, some recent work looking at Amazon Marketplace, basically looking at after the FDA, like 2 years after the FDA, what kinds of devices are on there? Are they following good marketing practices and things like that? And you see here that there are a fairly large number of devices listed on Amazon, but sometimes they're not FDA registered, but they are claiming to be. For instance, we actually kind of benchmark these devices against FDA registry versus listing in Amazon. Nearly 70% of the devices that are listed in Amazon saying that they're FDA registered / approved, they're not. That means people may be buying over-the-counter hearing aids that are actually not over-the-counter hearing aids. And then also, these devices are not supposed to be marketed for people with severe hearing loss, for instance, but it seems like that happens also fairly commonly. And another really important thing is that for direct-to-consumer devices, one of the most important thing is basically return policy. And FDA mandates that manufacturers or sellers should have a clear return policy, and that doesn't happen always too. So basically, warning that there are a lot of devices in the market, but there is also a lot of confusion in the market that it's really difficult for people to know. On moving on from the devices to service delivery model, traditionally it used to be like this. People get tested, they choose the device, they purchase, they use, and go on. And direct-to-consumer devices has basically changed this. So we see now a lot of the device purchase happens from their significant others as a gift. Especially device $100 to $400 are very popular Christmas gifts. We know this from scrapping Amazon user feedback and analyzing that very detail. So this has kind of really changed. So we need to really start to think about alternative service delivery model, not necessarily audiologist-led. We have done some really nice work in the communities, particularly in South Africa, basically using these devices for testing, demonstrating, supporting, mainly through community healthcare workers. And what we know is that we can actually use self-fitting over-the-counter hearing aids to do a really good test, in the community where we don't need to have sound booths, especially using some earbuds as a way to reduce the noise. And then we can also provide support to community health workers with very limited education. That means, most of what we do in audiology can be done by somebody who has fairly limited education. We also have a large study currently in our lab here in Anschutz and Boulder, where we are testing out 4 different types of service delivery models. The first is a prescription hearing aid fitted by an audiologist. And then we have 3 different types of over-the-counter hearing aids. One is supported by in-person audiologist. Second one is a remote support. Third one is self-fitting. They do it all on their own. And then we're also measuring a large number of outcomes, like 20 plus outcomes, questionnaires, behavioral testing, like speech in quiet, speech in noise, cognitive testing, and also how their brain changes as a result of hearing aid use. One thing that I'm really interested in thinking about is also, how can these devices be supported? So the first thing is, of course, people need to end up with a reasonably good quality device. And after that, they need to have some kind of, support system. And I see many different avenues. Self-care, of course, is basically how the OTCs have been conceptualized. But I do think there are other models like community-based care, volunteer-led care, pharmacists providing some information, and maybe even primary care providing some limited information could be highly beneficial. I think really important thing to think about is until recently, in audiology, our hearing space, it was all to achieve precision, to get precise hearing measurement, to predict what kinds of targets they need, fitting them, and then pursuing them. But that only served limited number of people. And suddenly we have started embracing public health approaches. Well, we don't need to have perfect understanding of their hearing. We don't need to fit them a perfect hearing aid. So can we actually provide something that can have measurable benefit, even if that benefit is small? I think that is where the field is moving. We're also starting to think a lot in terms of looking at wellness, auditory issues as a wellness issue, not necessarily as a medical. Of course, it could be a medical issue, but it could also have wellness factors. So there are a really good validated scale where we could basically just measure the disability, basically understand how their self-reported disability, not worry about how their hearing loss is measured in the clinic, but just understand what kinds of problems they're facing in a day-to-day life, and then offer them a choice of not doing anything, maybe doing some communication training, or maybe using devices. And when it comes to devices, again, different types of devices. So I think there are different things that we could do, especially in the health service research framework. I know that in your group, there is a large group of people focusing on this. So if anybody is interested, I'm willing to talk and explore the opportunities. Also wanted to put in a plug that I have two laboratories. One is a physical laboratory, auditory lab that I share, and the other one is more of a virtual laboratory. That means the way we think about this is, we come up with questions, and we also think about, I have a group of researchers in South Africa and many other countries. We think about where this can be done very quickly. So that means we can conceptualize a study and do a study in like 3 months. For instance, this Apple Airport study, I didn't have the bandwidth here, but we got the data in South Africa in like 3 months. So this is really important for two reasons. One, the technology turnaround is really fast, so we need to produce good information very quickly. Second, as we know, I've worked in different settings. After coming to Anschutz, what I realized was, in order for us to do good work, you need to have an R01. Otherwise, there is a lot of overheads here, and I think unless you take advantage of the hospital data, maybe it is really hard to do anything in the lab. So I think it helps for us to think more broadly and things like that. So again, very happy to talk if there are any opportunities for collaborating in the clinic, to create patient education materials, also to do any clinical research or research in the laboratory. So just to sum this up, I think there are a range of devices in terms of design, features, functionalities, at a fairly affordable cost that are available for people with perceived mild to moderate hearing loss. So early research on these devices show that they could have reasonable benefits to people. We do not have good understanding of who is a good candidate for us to put it through this journey, and who probably should go and see an audiologist. I think right now the way we are thinking is everybody should maybe seek direct-to-consumer journey. And if they fail, maybe they go back to an audiologist. But that is not that is basically a guesswork. That is not a good way to categorize people. So there is a lot of work that we could do clinically, without much resources. And then we do have many studies, undergoing, basically looking at device quality, but more importantly, different service delivery models. So with that note, I open it up for questions, and I may not be able to answer everything. If I can't, I'm sure I can find somebody who can. So thank you.
All right. I'll handle the microphone. Yeah, questions. Thank you so much for that talk.
I was curious about the dementia aspects that you talked about at the beginning of the study. And in particular, is there anything that has looked at these self-fitting, like Apple AirPods or anything? And I know they're new, so they're just probably not out there, but like, do those less sophisticated, less expensive hearing aids also reduce risk of dementia? Do we know that, or no?
I think a simple conclusive answer is we don't know, but I can offer some things that may be very helpful to get to that answer. So the first thing is, I made a comment earlier saying we don't really know much about what is the minimum technology level that is required to produce reasonable benefits. And when I say reasonable benefits, for me, improved hearing, reduced communication problems, and maybe something else. Okay. Traditionally, hearing aid trials only focused on measuring self-reported, outcomes, like questionnaire-based outcomes, and sometimes laboratory-based outcomes. For instance, put people on a laboratory study how they do speech in noise, things like that. But we do know that hearing aids could have a placebo effect. That means even with these two different measures, even if you do that in a very controlled environment, it could have placebo effect. That means we kind of need double blind studies, which rarely happen with hearing devices, because how do you blind these devices, right? Now we started adding additional outcomes like cognitive outcomes and then brain outcomes. So those could provide some insights to that. For instance, as soon as these over-the-counter hearing aids become available, we did a study here in this campus and in Boulder campus looking at these outcomes. What we found was, with a really small sample size of 10, they actually had a pretty good self-reported and behavioral benefits. That means they actually felt good and also performed well in the laboratory. But when we look at their EEG data, looking at their brain changes, we actually did not see much change. But we do know that a really well-fitted hearing aids could have change in their brain. That means their cortical neuroplasticity, like they're basically the brain areas that focus on hearing, usually taken over by other areas like vision and whatever. But that, if they are well-fitted hearing aids and if they start using them, that could actually reverse, to some degree. We did not see that with over-the-counter hearing aids. But there were two things that we did not study really well, because of the limitations of the device. One is, for the brain to change, they need to give enough signal. That means we know that usually people need to use these devices for 6, 8, 10 hours. At that time, these devices did not do a data logging. So we did not know how much they used. Did they use more situationally or did they use it all day long? So that is one thing. And the second thing is, all of the over-the-counter hearing aids, they use what is called as a comfort fit. So comfort fit basically means, we have these prescription targets derived from the hearing loss severity category. But most of these devices are underfit. They kind of go right, 5, 10 dB below these targets. This is good because people will keep the devices only if they're comfortable. So it's a really good sales strategy because if they're not comfortable, they're not going to keep them. But what we don't know is, do we actually need a really good fit, or is this underfit devices reasonable? So for the brain to change, do we need to use all day long, and do we need to have very accurate fit? Those two are still, we don't know. So just to come back to your question, I think, in my opinion, I think this could be a really good, reasonable option, but I don't know whether that could be a reasonable option in the short term or in the long term. So I think that that is one of the reasons I'm really interested in focusing more on preset devices and Apple devices and things like that, because I think most people in the beginning may only be situational users. They may not want to use 8, 10, 12 hours. So, although maybe one thing to add, there was a study published using PSAPs. I think this came from Canada. It was published like last week. I haven't read that fully yet, but that basically showed some brain changes even with PSAPs. But I don't think they had very good data on how good the fit was and things like that. And also, one thing to add, we actually have capability to do all of this in Boulder. So if anybody is interested, we could actually handle most of that with some collaboration. So sorry, go ahead.
Thanks for a great talk. Is it safe to say the general assumption of hearing loss is it's an age-related issue? Would you
I think age is one of the biggest risk factors. That as we get older, more people have hearing loss. So
I just wanted to make sure if we were on the same page with that, then that kind of sets the stage for my question, because I think in that pyramid schematic you showed early on, you had the age range of 12 to 84 at the bottom of the pyramid. So my question is more from the perspective of social anxiety around viewing this as a wellness or lack thereof process. So I'm thinking, if I'm a young adult and I have hearing loss, what is the social stigma? Do we have data around the social stigma of hearing aids, such that if it's on a societal level, if we're assuming that this is an age-related issue, but then I am a 20-year-old with marked hearing loss, and now I'm visually you can see that I'm wearing a hearing aid, and then understanding how social stress affects all those other integrative physiological dysfunctions that you showed integrating into hearing loss. Is the field considering that in any way, or is that being talked about? Just curious.
So very good question, but several different aspects here. First, I'll clarify that this figure is basically a function of degree of hearing loss. That means in the bottom, we have lower degree of hearing loss. In the top, we have higher degree of hearing loss. Like that means, it's basically audiometric results. The bottom here you see that is basically people with normal hearing but having speech noise problems. But I do get the point that there could be issues of image. I use the image because for me that is the simplest one to think about. I worked a lot with a sociologist, a very prominent sociologist in Sweden, who was really against stigma theory. I think in audiology we have a ton of literature on using stigma theory, but he had a really strong or an important point, basically saying that stigma theory is kind of flawed from the beginning because it starts with a negative connotation. That means you kind of assume that people will have negative, but people could have positive connotation. They could have neutral connotation. So we did some work using another framework called social representation theory that doesn't study people at an individual level, but that basically looks at how is at a population level, what kind of representations are available. And we did studies in several different countries, and basically showed that people could have positive, neutral, negative connotation to hearing loss as well as hearing devices. Okay, so it's not uniform, but we do know that from stigma theory research in audiology that both people who's using the device, basically stereotyping themselves, are people who are watching. Like basically, if you show an image of somebody wearing devices, whatever, there could be an image issue related to the device. I think how the market has responded is basically to come up with different designs. You see, they've come up with different form factors and device and things like that. I think that has answered, maybe started to address that question, but not addressed that fully. So I think there is still a lot of image issues surrounding hearing aid use. Although I see that is changing quite rapidly. So.
Thank you so much for your talk today. I have a comment, which is I see the 2,500 is sort of probably the max benefit we're going to get out of a hearing aid. So I think from a clinical standpoint, letting folks know when they go to the audiologist, you don't have to spend $6,000 is very helpful. I think they get sort of convinced to do that. So I think that data is really, really helpful. So thank you for that. And then two questions. One is there any research into losing hearing aids? Because this is what we deal with all the time in hospitals and nursing homes, and it feels like that should be figured out. And then the second one is about cochlear implants, and at what point you think about that.
Yeah. So very good question. I'll start with the comment of hearing aid benefit that may be very helpful for you. So nearly more than half of the insurance don't cover hearing aids as a benefit. And even the half or less than half of hearing aids, insurance where they say they cover, they may have really tiny benefits. It's basically you buy a hearing aid, we'll give you $500 or something like that. So it's very rare that hearing aids are covered through insurance quite well. We have quite a few studies in audiology showing that there is no significant improvement with higher level technology. Like for example, we talked a lot about prescription hearing, like direct to consumer devices. I think there is a lot of improvement, increasing the money you spend. But when you go to prescription hearing aids, they start around $1,000, go to $6,000. There is no studies basically showing that $6,000 hearing aid will give you better benefit than $1,000 hearing aid. In fact, we have a systematic review that is under review currently. So, but on the contrary, when people come to purchase hearing aids, they behave like a typical consumer. They generally want to buy the most expensive hearing aid that they can afford. So that usually happens. Although most people could actually start off with the entry level, $1,000, $1,300. For example, you could get an entry level hearing aids in Costco for $1,000, $1,100. UC Health is highly competitively priced, and our entry level hearing aids are like $1,300. Although that is the case, when I look at our hearing aid sales, we're usually at a higher end. We're retailing higher end. That is just how the consumer behavior is currently. The second point is about loss of hearing aids. I don't think there is any good research published on that topic because it is very hard to study that in a controlled population. But I think that will be a wonderful thing to do to kind of see how frequently people lose, for what reasons they lose, and what they do. But most of the time, if people purchase a prescription hearing aids, they have like a warranty, like a 3-year warranty, and they could have like a loss and damage. So two things that happen all the time is my dog chewed my hearing aid, or I put my hearing aid in a microwave, and then so these two things happen like every week. So and then if there is a loss and damage, they can just get it replaced. Many of the over-the-counter hearing aids, people could purchase this. So it doesn't come automatically, but they could usually purchase this with some extra money. So now going back to cochlear implants, Traditionally, cochlear implants candidacy was very strict, focusing on people, with severe profound hearing loss. It has kind of loosened quite a bit now, so even people with a moderate to severe, like moderately severe, for instance, 60, 65 decibels of hearing loss, if they have poor speech understanding, so if they score like 60% or below in certain speech testing, they are, eligible to be a cochlear implant candidacy. So the cochlear implant candidacy has kind of widened very quickly, although we don't get referrals on that very well at all. So in fact, there is a lot of awareness and education that needs to be done around cochlear implant candidacy. I'm very happy to kind of share any information you need. I have a very passionate colleague, otologist, Dr. Ashwin Nasiri. I'm happy to kind of have her maybe present on a cochlear implant candidacy, things like that. But again, that has widened quite a bit in terms of who can be eligible, especially in the last year. Even Medicare now uses this 60-60 criteria, basically 60 dB or above hearing loss, and then 60% or less speech discrimination scores.
We have one question from the online chat. Someone wanted to know whether or not behind the ear hearing aids interfere with wearing eyeglasses.
Yeah, all the time. So behind the ear hearing aids interfere with the eyeglasses and also with the mask. So during COVID was the period where most people lost their hearing aids, things like that. But the behind the hearing aids have become much smaller now. I think there is much less interference wearing glasses. It also depends on the shape of, some people have pinna that is kind of right tucked under their, so it really depends. And I think for most people, using glasses and hearing aids at the same time should not be a problem, but it could, depending on, the ear structure and their, how their pinna, it could actually have. And I think when we do prescription hearing aid, these are all the things that we look into on what types of hearing aid they should get. But it could have, depending on what glasses and types of it could interfere.
Good morning. I'm Katie Nearing. Good morning, Vinaya.
Hi, Katie.
Well, I know we've met many times online, but I don't think we've ever met in person. First, I just wanted to express gratitude, and then I have two straightforward questions. So gratitude. Thank you for being part of our research roadshows and for your teams offering this service to the community to learn about their hearing health and getting them connected to services, as well as connecting communities to this very important research. Also, thank you for engaging our ORS consult service. I hope that that was helpful to your team as you were planning this research. And thank you for engaging community health workers. So my questions, is there any research on whether or the degree to which when we have listening devices, assistive listening devices in clinics, whether that supports identifying people with hearing loss and getting them connected to further evaluation? So that's my first question. My second question is there any research on how the engagement of caregivers in especially the hearing aid fitting process and learning about how to care for the devices and things like that might support continued and successful use of the devices?
Yeah. Thanks, Kerry, for two excellent questions. I'll start with the first one. I actually don't know if there's any research on use of assistive devices in identifying a problem. So I think that'll be interesting for me to go look. But what we know is usually assistive devices in the clinics are offered for people who have like a severe communication problems. For instance, we have some in the clinic when we have people with severe to profound hearing loss maybe come and are consulting with otologists. They're not able to communicate. Then without testing or whatever, we have some amplifiers that we basically go and give, and that helps in communication. We kind of do the same thing, in inpatient testing or whatever, but I don't know if that has been used, because most of the time we know that they have a problem. They have a big problem, usually. So I don't know if that has been used to kind of identify different levels. And in fact, I don't even know if that needs to be used, because now we have many ways of testing very efficiently. I think in the past, maybe this could have been a good way, but now we could do, for instance, when I came to UC Health, I proposed that we should implement a digits in noise screening, that can go out in the web, and people could basically kind of take that test like, for 2 to 3 minutes. That was approved, but we never had the resources to build that patch between that technology and then My Health Connection. So that is still waiting on the line to happen somewhere. So that we could actually use some fairly simple things to accurately identify if people have hearing loss, but also predict what type of hearing loss they have. The second question is about a support system. So there is no direct research looking at how people are. For instance, when somebody has over-the-counter hearing aids, a lot of the time they're getting support from their friends, family members, and things like that. So we don't know. Any insights that we have is I do have interest in doing kind of consumer-oriented research. For instance, this was really hard to publish many, many years ago, but it is becoming easier. I used to kind of go scrap data from Amazon or basically look at reviews and things like that and get insights. And we know that people are purchasing devices for their significant other. They are supporting them, things like that. But we don't have a very good understanding of how much support, and if that supports translate into somebody being successful or less successful. It makes sense to think that, of course, if somebody's supporting, they will probably likely to keep the devices, use them better, whatever. But there are no good research on the topic.
I think that takes us to 8:30. If we could get another round of applause, just thanking Dr. Manchaiah for his talk. You're sticking around to chat with anyone who's interested?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm happy to stay back. And again, if you have any clinical needs, even outside this, always reach out. Very happy to collaborate, engage, share. Also very happy to collaborate in research. Thank you so much.
Thank you.